Well, that is one animal that knows how to protect her young. Let me share one of my favorites. The elephant,
是一个我最喜欢
Da
的
Shang
大象。
in Chinese. And the elephant, of course, is very small.
这大象
And there's a lot of predators in Africa. And most predators are not big enough to tackle a full-size elephant. So they usually will go after the babies. And what I learned from the TV show was that whenever there was a herd of elephants together and they saw a predator, they did something really amazing. And have you heard that phrase, it takes a village to raise a child? Elephants know what that means. Because what they do is they circle up and they put the baby behind them as a shield of protection against any predators who are coming.
防护所。
Elephants and pandas know how to protect their young.
他们的
Now, I have a story for you.
我有个故事。
Many of you know that when I was a child, my brother and I would help my grandpa raise chickens. Have any of you ever done that
我
before?
外公养鸡，
Many times, and you had to count the eggs, and they'd always peck you.
我们需要去拿那个鸡
And
的时候，鸡会啄我们。
one day, my brother and my mom, we went out to take care of the
我
chickens,
们要去照顾鸡。
and we saw one
我
of
看到一
these.
个
Do you know what that is?
yeah weasel，
It's a mink.
Mink?
It's almost like a weasel. Now, when you get one of these in your chicken coop, there's trouble.
我也不知道是什么。
Because minks don't eat the meat, they suck the blood.
哦，他们只吸血。
So we had one of these in there, and the mink would take the chickens and grab them by the necks, suck out the blood, and leave the chicken.
他们会咬断鸡的脖子，然后
But
吸
we
血。
have a hero in this story.
但我们有一个英雄在这个。
While my brother and my mom and I were in the chicken house, we did not know that the mink was there,
妈妈在
but
鸡舍里面
someone
不知道有一
did
个动
see
物
the mink. My dog, Rosie.
但我的狗狗发现了，
That's my brother. That's not me. I didn't have a bowl cut.
然后它去保护了我们。
Rosie had a super sense of protection. And I still remember this as a child.
我的狗叫做
Rosie, when she saw the mink, she didn't bark. She growled and she looked straight at it. And she was saying, "That's my family. Don't mess with them." Isn't it amazing how even animals know how to protect from danger and from threats?
危险中保护自己。
Well, you know, just as there was a mink in the chicken coop, there was a fox in Israel.
狐狸，
And we learn about him in today's passage. We often forget that Jesus lived in a very political world. If we think we have problems with politics, just look at Jesus' world. They didn't have Democrats and Republicans, but they had a lot of other people who had
有
issues.
很多人，有很
And they've always been a place of religious and political turmoil. Even today, with the conflicts between Israel and Palestine and the Jews and the Muslims trying to all coexist in the same place together.
同一个地方。
My favorite illustration, of course, is in the past,
在过去，
Israel was like the mice,
就像
and the big nations were like the cats.
嗯哼
Big nations like Assyria and Egypt and eventually Rome.
埃及，
And all of these big cats have one thing in common: power play. They played with power. They used power for their own purposes.
然后去
In Rome, there was the Roman Empire, and they had a slogan called Pax Romana, which means Roman peace. Now, it sounds good, and it was good for those who were in the Roman Empire, but what did Pax Romana mean for other people? war. It meant that
但对
Rome was going to occupy them and control the ways in which they existed in their land. And so we have many key players in Jesus' political world, including Herod Agrippa, who is the Herod of this story. This is the son of Herod the Great, or as I like to call him, Herod the Not So Great. This was the Herod who you learn from in the Christmas story, who was so paranoid
是在
that he had children murdered in Bethlehem
他们会
because he did not want to see the rise of another
犹太的
king.
男童。
Now this Herod, his son, Herod Agrippa, he was the governor of Galilee, the northern territory of Israel. And then there is Pontius Pilate. You remember Pontius Pilate? Pontius Pilate was the governor of Jerusalem, down in the hill country, in the
变法的
south.
长官，
And what I find so fascinating about this story in Luke is that right before this passage about Herod comes up, Luke tells us a story about how Pontius Pilate had murdered Galileans in Jerusalem, and that their blood was mingled with the blood of the
是加利利人
sacrifices.
来自北边的人。
That just gives you a short glimpse about what the political tension was like at that time. You thought we have problems? They had a lot of problems.
你以为我们有
And there were a lot of people who were grabbing for power, including the religious establishment in Jerusalem. You had disputes between the traditional Sadducees and the Pharisees. And then you had people out on the outskirts, the Zealots, who wanted to have war with Rome and to use violence as a way to claim Jerusalem as their own once again. Everyone
每个人
wanted to play with
都希
power.
望能够掌握权力。
And you know what is so fascinating? Jerusalem, do you know what it means in Hebrew?
你知道耶路撒冷
Have you heard of
的
shalom?
在希伯
Peace,
来文当中，
salam, peace.
沙龙意味着
Jerusalem means foundation of peace.
也叫耶路撒冷，
But there
意
was
思是
nothing
和平的基石。
except war.
但是在以
and
色列经
power.
常有战争。
Jerusalem was a place of power. And last Sunday, as we explored Luke chapter 4, power has a role in the temptation of Jesus. Satan comes to Jesus in the wilderness and recognizes that Jesus has power, but the question is, how would Jesus use this power?
但耶稣会怎么
Would Jesus use it for his own needs?
但是
Would Jesus use the power to escape suffering?
还是为了他？
Would Jesus use the power to manipulate
耶
others?
稣用权力是为了掌控别人吗？
Satan reminds us that we are all tempted with power.
撒旦。
So, how do we
我
use
们每个
power?
人都被权力。
This past week, Lindsay's mom and dad, they went to Washington, D.C., and they went to a wax museum. Have you ever been to those before?
蜡像
And I love this picture that Lindsay's mom
阳
sent
光
me.
喜欢这张照片。
How many of you would like to sit behind the Oval Office?
你们
The
有
desk
谁喜欢
in the White
白
House.
宫的
I don't know how he got there when Trump wasn't there. Let me ask you a question.
让我问你一个问题：
What would you do if you're president of the United States
你
for
会
a
做
day?
什么？如果你是美国总统，能做一天，
How would you use power?
你将怎么运用权力呢？
Would you use it to exploit others? Or would you use it to help
你
and
会
to
用
heal
权力
others?
去控制别人呢，还是去医治和帮助别人？
There are all kinds of people who love to play with power.
有很多人喜欢掌控权力。
This week we are reminded of the sad news of
这一
all of
场
those people in New Zealand who were worshiping at a
消
mosque
息，
and were killed.
在
And they were innocent people.
做礼拜的穆斯林被一个枪手
And it has to do with power.
杀了。
See, folks, power is used to keep the status quo. Power keeps people in power. And people will do anything possible to hold on to the power that they have. And that's where Herod comes in this story. Herod is threatened by Jesus. He sees the work that Jesus is doing in Galilee, and he is beginning to get nervous, just like his father. He begins to question Jesus' identity. He becomes suspicious of everything that Jesus is doing. And earlier in the gospel narrative, we learn that Jesus kills Jesus' own cousin, John the Baptist. Herod was a man who loved to play with power. And Luke understands this very well. In fact, Luke's gospel deals with people who love to use power. Luke's theme is always about those who are marginalized and those who are forgotten. Luke pays special attention to the poor. And he contrasts it to the way that the powerful exploit them. So for an example, in Mary's song in Luke chapter 1, Mary talks about how God turns their world upside down. How the proud will be humbled and the low would be exalted. And they see that the kingdom of God comes to set everything right, because people don't always know how to use power. I remember how Jesus went into the temple, or into the synagogue one day, and he began preaching the text from Isaiah, which says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me," to do what? To proclaim release for the captives. The good news to the poor. The good news to everyone. All of us, right? All of us. You see, Jesus had a different view of power. And he is confronted with that in this text, this very confusing text about Herod. A Pharisee comes, well-meaning probably, and says, "Get out of here, because Herod wants your hide. Herod wants to kill you. Get out and escape while you still can." Did you notice that the Pharisee is like Satan, giving Jesus a way out of death? Get away, save yourself. Use your power to save yourself. And Jesus has this way of calling a spade, right? He says, "Go tell that fox what's up. Go tell that fox why I am here. I have come to heal the sick. I have come to cast out demons. I have come for ministry. And I have a mission from God." Today is St. Patrick's Day, and today we celebrate a missionary named St. Patrick, a man who was from Britain and was captured by people and taken into slavery into Ireland, and escaped, and had a revelation from God that God had called him for a mission. that God was going to call him back to the place of his captivity in Ireland, where he would bring the gospel of the good news into a land that was not always received, because just like Israel,
没有人听，
Ireland had people who loved to play with power.
就像以色列，
That there were people who would stand in St. Patrick's Way, and St. Patrick was imprisoned many times and always found a way out. Just like St. Patrick, Jesus says that fox doesn't understand why I'm here. That fox doesn't understand that I'm here for a mission.
知道来
Not to use power to hurt or exploit, but to use power to heal.
我们并不是用权力去，
The power of a bully,
而是
not him, the mink, the power
治还有帮助
of a bully is nothing compared to the power of a Savior.
正如发言的权利。
And it wasn't just Herod. Jesus begins to lament about his journey to Jerusalem.
为他的
And he uses a very familiar image, the image of a chicken.
所伤心，
He talks about how in Jerusalem, the prophets were killed because the religious and the political loved to play with power, and they didn't like it when the prophets would expose the abuse of power. And Jesus says, a prophet cannot be killed except out of Jerusalem. Jesus is saying, when I go to Jerusalem, I know what's going to happen. I'm going to be killed.
我将会被杀。
And that's the way Jerusalem is. And then Jesus begins to lament Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem.
耶路撒冷，耶路撒冷，
If only
如果你知道，
you were like the baby chicks
你能像小鸡一样，
that my brother and I raised together on a farm.
嗯，
And when you put your finger into the box, guess what they did?
你把手，
They huddled around your finger.
然后它会挤到你手那里。
You see, Herod and all of his buddies
嗯，
played with power.
这些弟兄们都喜欢
But God
但
has
是
a
神
compassion
有一
for
颗
his
悲悯
people.
的心，对于他的子民。
Jesus invokes the image of a mother hen to symbolize
描述了
the kind of love and care that God really has for them and that God really has for us.
保护我们。
You know, it used to be if you called someone a chicken, that was an insult, right?
这样子
You meant they were cowardly, that they were not brave. But, and honestly, a mother
是
chicken
说
is very brave.
其实是很勇敢。
There's this story that circulated the internet about
我们看到网
a fire that occurred in Australia. And the fire burned down all of the trees and all of the animals
上
left.
树，
And when the fire finally died and the firemen came to inspect all of the damage, they saw a mother hen
在
who was charred to death. And they lifted up the body of the mother hen, and underneath her were 6 baby chicks, still alive.
正大火过后，母鸡下面的6个小鸡
Isn't
就
that power?
存活。这难道不是
You see, Herod loved to use power to exploit,
希律王用自己的权利
but
去
Jesus
保护人，
used power to give life
但是耶稣用权
and
利
to
去
sacrifice
给人
himself.
生命。
What I love most about this passage is Jesus said, I must go to
耶
Jerusalem.
路撒冷，
Did you get that?
你
Jesus wanted
耶稣
to do it.
去做，
Jesus wanted
耶稣
to go and to give his life for a ransom of many.
去拯救别人。
And that is a power, my friends, that not even the darkest of powers can ever exploit or take away. Jesus knew that when he would come to Jerusalem, that there would be many powers that would be at work. But when Jesus died on the cross, my friends, Jesus dismantled all of those powers. Jesus took away their power, and Jesus brought about a new power.
但是却带来了一个新的能力，还有权。
Why did the chicken cross the road? To get on the other side.
为什么？
Why did Jesus cross to Jerusalem?
因为要去到另一边，
To bear the cross.
耶稣要去到耶路撒冷。
There are powers today that divide us. There are powers that hurt us. There are powers that enslave us. And there are powers that defy God. And Lent is more than just about giving up chocolate for 40 days. No. When we come together during this time of Lent, we are invited to let go of our own power and entrust ourselves to the power of God. Satan gave Jesus a way out of the cross, and Jesus said no. You know why? Because Jesus said yes to the cross. And when Jesus said yes to the cross, he was saying no to power plays. And when Jesus said yes to the cross, he was saying no to violence, sin, and oppression. And my friends, when Jesus said yes to the cross, he was saying yes to you. Jesus' yes was a self-giving yes. I can't help but think about Joseph, who was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery. And one day he's reunited with all of his brothers, and he looks at them and says, "What you intended for harm, God has intended for good, to save you and to rescue you." Friends, that is the story of Lent. While all of these powers sought to kill and destroy Jesus, it would ultimately be intended for good. That Jesus would dismantle all of those powers and give us his life and raise us through his resurrection. There was another power player that you might know. His name was Paul. Like Herod, he wanted to kill Jesus' disciples. And it wasn't until Jesus came to Paul in his true power on the road to Damascus that Paul came to realize that true power came from Christ. And so years later, Paul would write this to the church in Philippi. "For whatever were gains to me, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ. For my sake I have lost all things. I consider them garbage, that I might gain Christ." My friends, we are shaped by the cross, and we are saved by the cross. What is God calling you to let go so that you may return to him?